Kat, and today I'm going to be discussing my thesis, which is that there needs to be better education and safeguards introduced into society to prevent the abuse of disabled women and children. The reason I chose to speak about this topic is because it is something I feel very strongly about as a disabled individual myself. Before we jump straight into the issue itself, I am going to define two terms for you: disability and ableism. The Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability as a person who has a physical or cognitive impairment that limits daily life activity. Challenges that relate to disability include mental health issues, harassment from family, friends, and strangers, lack of accessibility in education, and wheelchair spaces. For example, lack of wheelchair space accessibility looks like this. This is Campbell Hall, one of the oldest buildings at York College, Pennsylvania, and as you can see, there is no identified wheelchair entrance. The two doors to the sides of the building are actually fake. They're not doors, and there's no identification to where you can enter the building with the wheelchair. This is one of the supposed wheelchair entrances to Campbell Hall, but as you can see, there is no identification. This is where you can enter with the wheelchair, and there is also no button to open this door. So if you were in a wheelchair, you would not be able to get in through this entrance, despite the wheelchair ramp. It has no identification that this is a wheelchair entrance, but this area does happen to have a pushed open button. Ableism is a very much normalized form of discrimination within society, whether it be lack of wheelchair accessibility or being told you should not pursue further education because of a cognitive impairment. Most importantly, ableism helps perpetuate traumatizing experiences involving abuse of persons with disabilities. The main victims of these traumatizing situations are women and children with disabilities. These forms of abuse include intimate partner abuse, sexual abuse or assault, physical abuse, verbal emotional abuse, or disability-specific abuse. Intimate partner abuse occurs in married relationships and dating relationships. This form of abuse is typically about control and is a combination of physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal emotional abuse, and sometimes financial abuse. Sexual abuse is forcing an individual to repeatedly participate in sexual activity that they have no desire to be in. Sexual assault is similar to this, but is typically not a reoccurring event. Physical abuse is the intentional act of injuring or causing physical trauma to another person. Verbal emotional abuse is the act of degrading, gaslighting, or emotionally manipulating another person. Disability-specific abuse is using someone's disability against them. For example, disability-specific abuse can look like hiding an individual's medication from them just because you're angry, even though they need it. In 2013, over 70% of persons with disabilities reported being abused. More specifically, 87.2% reported verbal abuse, 50.6% reported physical abuse, and 42% reported sexual abuse. Furthermore, women with developmental disabilities are 4 to 10 times more likely than the non-disabled population to suffer from abuse as they age. Also in 2013, 1 in 4 women reported being victims of sexual abuse as children. 12.2% reported being victims of sexual abuse as children. 15% reported being victims of physical abuse as children, and 26% reported being victims of verbal and emotional abuse as children. Over 80% of these participants identified their parents as their perpetrators. Children with developmental disabilities are at least 4 times more likely to be victims of abuse than children without disabilities. Despite these high rates, it is well known that assistive programs and helplines respond inappropriately. These inappropriate responses include blaming the victim or the victim's disability. If we could enforce proper training for assistive programs and helplines, appropriate responses would increase and victims would be able to receive the proper help they need. Just remember, it all starts with you, because the normalization of ableism normalizes the abuse of disabled persons, because in our society, what we view as good is what we typically view as common. And despite the fact that abuse of disabled persons is common, it will never be good.